everyone, it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today I'm filming, in my opinion, a super exciting, a decade in the making, if you will, video. I'm gonna be looking back into the past 10 years of publications for YA novels and pick my personal favorites of the novels I have read. So to be clear, I'm gonna be going to 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, so on and so forth till we get to 2019 and pick my favorite book from that publication year. Keep in mind that just because a book came out in 2010, I might not have read it till 2016, but I wanted to organize this by publication year. This was honestly difficult, some years more so than others, like 2013 and 2016, very strong years within the YA genre, in my opinion, and I had a hard time narrowing it down, but regardless, this was such a fun exercise. One, to pick my favorites in YA novels in the past decade, but two, for the books that I did read 10, 9, 8 years ago when I was, you know, a teenager, a lot of these books were really defining into my reading taste and my overall like perspective on YA novels and really drove me ultimately to start a YouTube channel. But anyway, enough rambling from me, let's go ahead and dive into the video. The first year was 2010, I was 15 years old, and the book that I've decided to pick was Shipbreaker by Paolo Bacigalupi. This book I read in 2010, it came out in 2010, and was one of my favorite books for the longest time. Still is. Paolo Bacigalupi is one of my favorite authors. I find his novels absolutely breathtaking and beautiful, but this book, when I read it in high school, blew my mind. I just had never encountered anything quite like this within the YA genre. It was dark, it was harrowing, but so beautifully written, and also made me realize that I loved, you know, fantasy with a dystopian twist. Prior to that, I was reading a lot of dystopian, Hunger Games, things like that, but this was one of my first kind of fantasy dystopian novels, which really made me want to read more books like that. This is basically a dystopian style novel set in a futuristic America where essentially like global warming or some sort of catastrophe has kind of ruined society as we know it. We follow our main character who lives in this Gulf Coast, and he spends his time basically stripping old oil tankers for parts, for copper, for iron, and selling it to make a living. Him and his friends basically make a very meager existence, finding copper to survive, but one day our main character, Naylor, as he's called, stumbles upon a fully intact ship. So he has to make a decision to either remove it all and make the fortune of his lifetime, or sail it and try to find a new life somewhere else. It's so good. It just made me think so much. I really enjoyed this novel, so it was one I had to pick for 2010 because it was also so fundamental to like my reading experience. Moving on to 2011, for this I had to pick Froi of the Exile by Melina Marchetta. This is the second book to one of my all-time favorite YA fantasy trilogies. One I did not read in 2011, but I read not too far after. It was one of the first series I read while being on BookTube, and I loved so much, and I just wanted to shout from the rooftops. But this is such an extraordinary, multi-perspective YA fantasy story. And Melina Marchetta is also a contemporary author, so her strengths of characters and relationships I really feel like shines through in the best way possible within this fantasy series. This is a book series where the main character for each book kind of changes and shifts through time, and literally a lot of time passes through this entire series, but we're essentially following a fantasy world where there was one kingdom that was basically destroyed, overrun by another kingdom. So all the residents, both the prince and everyone who's lived there, kind of had to scatter and become refugees in other lands. And in the first one, it's kind of about the prince of this kingdom bringing his people home and kind of trying to resettle the land that they lost, and also all the political consequences of this, both war and conflict and like past hatred kind of bubbling back up to the surface. It's an incredible YA fantasy story, still one of my favorites, one that I actually want to reread, but if you have not checked it out, I would highly implore you to do so. It's kind of one that came out kind of before YA fantasy, I feel like got a lot of popularity behind it, so if you haven't read it, read it. You will not be disappointed. Moving on to 2012. For this, I'm going to be picking The Crimson Crown by Cinda Williams-Chima. I had to include one of her novels in here. This is another book I read in 2012 during its publication. I have been reading Cinda Williams-Chima's books since I was in 7th grade. She is truly the most fundamental YA author I have come across, in that she's just been a part of my life for so long and has been a favorite author of mine for as long as I can remember, that she is like part of me growing up. But The Crimson Crown is the fourth and final book to the original Seven Realms series, which was my favorite series ever in high school and into college, and like still one of my favorite series of all times. But it was the book I would sneak and read in class. Like, I would have it open on my lap and pretend to be taking notes, but I was actually reading The Crimson Crown or whichever book was out at the time in that series. Like, it was incredible. But the Seven Realms series is just a wonderful YA fantasy series that's multi-perspective, set in a world, again, with conflicting kingdoms. We follow two main characters. One is the crowned princess of the realm, and the other is a thief street lord called Cuff Alistair's, a nickname because he has cuffs on his wrists. This is a fantasy world that has magic and politics and like conflicting interests within both of those things, with the wizards kind of wanting to take more power from the crown and kind of all the different people caught in that crossfire. It's so good. There's romance and just intrigue. There's a lot of like movement. You kind of get to see a lot of this fantasy world, and after you read the original Seven Realms series, you can read the Shattered Realms series taking place in the same world, and also amazing. But yes, Crimson Crown 2012. Moving on to 2013. This was a big YA year for me for a lot of reasons. One, I feel like I fell headfirst into a particular fandom, and this series was how I found BookTube altogether. If it wasn't for the book series I'm about to mention, who knows where I would be to this day. But the winner of the 2013 crown is Clockwork Princess. If you read this book in 2013, which I did, and then was crying in the cafeteria afterwards because I was so emotionally destroyed by it, then you know what I'm talking about. The Infernal Devices was a movement, okay? Like, it completely makes me think of that time in my life, but also is still my favorite Cassandra Clare series of all time. When I read that book, I didn't think a more perfect book existed. It was just so amazing and made me cry and feel so many things, and I was so invested with these characters like I had never really been before, and it was such a wonderful experience reading it, so I had to pick Clockwork Princess for 2013 because honestly, few other books can top that experience of reading that book for me, even now in a lot of ways. The Infernal Devices series to me is Cassandra Clare at her best. Shadowhunter fueled world, but it's a historical fiction Shadowhunter world. We follow an institute in London, and we basically follow a cast of characters as they're fighting demons and protecting humanity from the evil that they are. There's romance, there's so much angst and so much back and forth in the romance that it's just so perfectly crafted that you will just be hanging on to every word that you read. Oh god, the turmoil in that series. I loved it, I still love it, would still make top of my list. Nothing. Clockwork Princess, say no more. Moving on to 2014. This book I'm actually gonna pick is not fantasy. Shock. It is going to be The Strange and Beautiful Sorrows of Ava Lavender. This is like magical realism, to be fair. So there's definitely like a fantastical element, but this book really was one of the first novels that I read that had magical realism and this sort of beautiful, flowery, ultra reality type of writing style that I also now just love so much, both in like a traditional fairy tale-esque fantasy setting or even like a modern day setting that kind of has this whimsical touch to it. It's just one of my favorite types of experiences within a novel, but The Strange and Beautiful Sorrows of Ava Lavender I just thought was so beautiful, and I still do. It's a book that I own on my bookshelf. I'll never get rid of it. It's just, it captured me so much when I read it at the time. But we basically in the story follow Ava Lavender and the generations of women that came before her, her mother and her grandmother. All the women within Ava's family have a kind of peculiar magical quality to them and often have tragic dealings when it comes to love. And Ava herself was actually born with wings, and this is kind of her peculiar disposition. And because of the wings and because of all this heartbreak that has befallen her family, she kind of goes on a quest to try to unravel and understand what is going on with her family. And through this quest, she also encounters some interactions with boys and kind of how the world views her wings and like what that means. It's beautiful, it's haunting. It's just honestly an extraordinary book. That it's another one I really need to reread, but it was so poignant, it made me cry. Great stuff. 2015 was a very hard year for me to pick, but I've decided to go with Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. This was a phenomenon, not just for me, but for the entirety of the internet. Everyone loves Six of Crows because quite frankly, it's an exceptional YA fantasy novel. It's so much fun, it has really dark atmosphere, and I also feel like it's a YA novel that really brings in a lot of the trends and themes of some adult fantasy kind of into YA, this kind of darker atmosphere, this darker morality, this sort of gray character kind of walking this line between good and bad, and also just like a huge multi-perspective story, which I just felt like overall was done exceptionally well. But Six of Crows is a heist-centered story. We follow a group of thieves set in this sort of dark Venetian Netherlands sort of world where trade and money is kind of king. At the beginning of the first one, this group of thieves is hired to break it into an impossible place, an impossible prison, for a lot of money. And you kind of follow them on their journey, you fall in love with them, there's kind of all these dark underworld dealings, and it's just like a really intriguing and fascinating world. And the sequel is amazing, and the Netflix show is gonna be amazing. And for me personally, it was the first encounter with Leigh Bardugo that I loved. I read her initial Grisha trilogy and found it to be okay, but Six of Crows was a book that I just fell headfirst into and just enjoyed the reading experience so much. And since then, I've loved all of Leigh Bardugo's books as well. So it's just a great book, 2015, Six of Crows. The next year, 2016, my pick for this might be a little controversial. Some people might not say it's YA, some people might say it's terrible. What can you do? But I'm going with A Court of Mist and Fury by Sarah J. Maas because it might not be the best book technically I read that year. Objectively, it might not be the best well-written or have the most complex and interesting plot, but in terms of readability and what my life became while I was reading that book and how I didn't want to do anything else except read about Rysand, I have to pick it because honestly, it enveloped my whole life. I became a part of a fandom and kind of that sort of like giddy, obsessive, oh my god, I love these characters, I need to know what happens next, that I haven't felt since Clockwork Princess. 3 whole years I didn't really feel like I was on the edge of my seat for some sort of romance, and it was so much fun. And because of that, I have to pick it because I know a lot of other people felt the same. We were all enraptured by this series. It was just captivating. But in case, you know, you qualify this more as a new adult, which I see that argument, and you're correct, but I don't have enough books to do a top new adult list of the past decade. I have a backup novel for this, and that is Torch Against the Night by Saba Tahir, which is the sequel to a great series by her, which is a Roman-inspired YA fantasy story. This is a series I read later in the decade, I think 2018, 2019, and I've loved them all so much. But the sequel did come out in 2016 and is my favorite so far in the series. As I said, it's a dual perspective story. One of the perspectives is a girl part of this class within this Roman-inspired fantasy world that is definitely very oppressed by the ruling body. So when our main character's brother is arrested, suspected of like being a spy essentially, she decides to kind of put herself on the line and infiltrate a really powerful military compound to try to get her brother out of jail. We also follow another main character who is a part of this really powerful like military body. He's a special trained soldier, and these two characters meet and their destinies become intertwined, and it is quite good. You love them, you love the magic, you love the world. It's so well written, and there's so much angst that doesn't feel like ridiculous angst, like true angst, in that this is a complicated political scenario. You can't see a viable solution to how to solve all these problems, and therefore you have angst. All right, next up, 2017, Thick as Thieves by Megan Wallen-Turner. This could not be this video if I didn't talk about Megan Wallen-Turner. The 4th book, Conspiracy of Kings, within this series came out in 2010, but I decided to save it for 2017 for Thick as Thieves because that was the year I read all of these books and they took over my whole life. This is an amazing classic YA fantasy series that honestly has stood the test of time. A lot of them came out in the early 2000s, but the 5th book came out obviously in 2017, and I love them so much, and I will talk about this series for the rest of time. But this is a Greek-inspired fantasy story, kind of using like Greek versus Persia conflict, and it's so amazing. The first novel, we follow our main character who is a thief, and he's basically broken out of prison by a government and told if he can steal a really impossible object, they'll grant him freedom. But to be fair, that is a really simplistic and simple view of this story, but it's the best way to kind of describe the setup because this world really cracks open. It's about nations, it's about love and war and politics and all of those amazing things. And the main characters will trick you over and over again. They're so smart. They're dealing with these political maneuvering so well. I have no idea how they get out of trouble like most of the time, but I know I love them and I love being tricked by them. They also have a component of like storytelling, which I love within the narrative style. In this world, the stories of the gods, like Greek mythology, are really important. So these kind of tales of what these great beings did is really interwoven, really when people are sitting like around a campfire telling stories, but also in the way that like these kind of godlike characters sometimes invade the narrative in ways you wouldn't expect. It's just so good. I love this series. There is a 6th one coming out hopefully soon, and I can't wait. And we only have 2 years left. Oh my goodness, but the next one I'm gonna be talking about is Spinning Silver. This is a book that if I could have been gifted enough to write a book and be an author, I wish I would have written this book, because every component of this novel is like my favorite thing. It is a fairy tale retelling set in historical Russia. It is a multi-perspective story following 3 different women in different places in Russian society. One is a lady whose main goal is to marry rich for her family. Another is a daughter of a Jewish moneylender and therefore ostracized by society in that way. And the last woman is the daughter of a very poor farmer. All of these women are taken advantage of, beaten down by society in different ways, in the same ways. Their stories overlap in extraordinary fashion, and you just see 3 women come into their power and take back what is theirs, and just, it is exceptional. On top of that, it has a fairy tale retelling element of Rumpelstiltskin, so there is a magical component woven in through all of this that is really well done as well. But truly, at its heart, you will just see these women and root for them and love them, and it is just so satisfying of a read. It is also so well written and beautiful. The prose is great. So this is a book I wish I was talented enough to have written myself, because I love everything about it. Now we've come to 2019, the last book of the past decade I'm gonna talk about, and I'm gonna say The Toll by Neal Shusterman. The Scythe series is just one of my favorites of the past decade. It is, in so many ways, a book series I just love. It is original, it's creative, it makes you think. Neal Shusterman as an author is one I've just read so many of his books as well growing up. If we were looking from 2000 to 2009, many of his books would have made that list as well. But to me, this is my favorite series of his by far. It is a dystopian series where we follow a world where humanity has basically solved all of its ills. There's no war, there's no famine, there's no poverty, and essentially humans can no longer die of like natural causes. They live forever. And a way to basically curb and control the population, society has basically ordained individuals called scythes to cull the population at like normal percentages to keep things from getting too out of hand. You would think these individuals who are scythes would be full of empathy and understanding given their line of work, but you kind of dive headfirst into the scythe politics and how corrupt many of the individuals can be. In this story, we follow 2 main characters who are scythe apprentices, scythes in training, and through their eyes, we kind of encounter a lot of these problems and hopeful solutions. We also have things like the Thunderhead, which is this all-knowing AI that also controls society, which brings up larger questions of like, what does it mean to be human? What is consciousness? Stuff like that. It's just so good, and it is so gripping. The plot is so fast-paced, you will not be able to put the series down. It'll make you think, cry, laugh, be terrified, because you can also see how society progressed to this point and like the folly of man and how we got there. Top-notch stuff, and definitely one that I would say best YA of 2019. Just one of the best series of the past few years. So strong, amazing from beginning to end. Had to have it on this list. Alrighty guys, so those are my favorite YA books of the past decade. Please let me know down below what your favorite books are from the past 10 years, as I would love to know. I think this is set an interesting look back, you know? Like, let's talk. What did you love? What was your 2013 favorite book? Was it Clockwork Princess? Because that was mine. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you again soon with another video soon. Goodbye.